LG C Series OLEDs have been a staple in the OLED market for a decade now. Although LG has been able to make incremental improvements each year, this is the first time a new panel technology has made its way into a C Series model. Does it make a difference? Hi, I'm Marco from RTINGS.com, and today, we're finally reviewing the LG C6H OLED, which is a new addition to LG C Series lineup. The TV utilizes LG's primary RGB tandem panel that was reserved for the G series last year and is designed to increase brightness and color vibrancy. There have been a few interesting changes across the entire OLED market this year, so be sure to subscribe if you want to stay up to date on all the new 2026 OLED models. The LG C6H is only available in 77 and 83-inch models, since LG decided to split up their C series lineup this year. If you buy a smaller size, you get the regular C6, which uses a standard WOLED panel. The TV sits right below the flagship G6 in LG's TV lineup, so it positions itself as a high-end option. Let's take a closer look to see if it lives up to the hype. It's no surprise that the C6H displays those inky, zero-nit blacks that OLEDs are known for. As good as mini LED TVs have gotten in terms of contrast, you still can't beat the pixel-level control OLEDs provide. Highlights truly pop against dark backgrounds, with no haloing around highlights and subtitles. This leads to a very impressive HDR experience, especially when watching movies or playing games that really take advantage of the format. Since this model uses an RGB tandem panel, it gets noticeably brighter than standard WOLEDs like the regular C6. The TV's brightness is more in line with the G series, peaking at just over 2200 nits in HDR with a 2% window. Naturally, its peak brightness declines as highlights take up a larger portion of the screen, but it still reaches close to 1000 nits with a 25% window and just over 350 nits with a 100% window, which is definitely respectable. This TV is bright enough to take advantage of most HDR movies and shows, so it doesn't need to rely on tone mapping as often as dimmer OLED models. Unlike older C series models, the TV isn't dimmer when you switch to its dedicated gaming picture mode. It's actually slightly brighter with our real scene tests, so you don't have to worry about trading in performance for brightness. If you find that your HDR movies and games look too dim, you can sacrifice some accuracy for a brighter image overall by enabling dynamic tone mapping, which drastically increases the brightness of the image. Not only is the TV bright in HDR, but its SDR brightness is excellent. There was a time when OLEDs were generally only recommended for darker environments, but the C6H is more than bright enough to handle glare in most well-lit rooms. We say most well-lit rooms, because the TV doesn't do much to reduce the intensity of light sources that are directly facing the screen. If you have a lamp, window, or other light source directly opposite the screen, mirror-like reflections are an issue. This is the case with many TVs that utilize glossy screen coatings, so this is not surprising. The C6H has a wide viewing angle, but it's actually a bit narrower than most other OLEDs on the market. Blacks stay deep, and there's barely any loss of brightness when watching the TV from an angle, but colors do shift slightly, which introduces a bit of a green tint. Still, the TV is a great option for wider seating arrangements, and no one will be fighting for the best seat in the house. A big advantage this TV has over QD OLED competitors is how well it retains its image quality in a bright room. Although blacks do become more raised as your room gets brighter, they still look very deep and avoid the charcoal look that QD OLEDs can have in a bright room. Colors also barely lose any saturation, so you're not trading in a ton of image quality when you flip your lights on. One of the main advantages of LG's tandem panel is the improvement in color volume. In SDR, the TV covers essentially the entirety of the DCI-P3 color space and has solid coverage of the super wide BT 2020 color space. In HDR, the TV covers 92% of the P3 color space at 1000 nits. This means it can display the vast majority of colors in most HDR content. It doesn't cover nearly as much of the rarely used BT 2020 space, and because it still uses a white subpixel to boost brightness, there's still some minor color washout with very bright highlights. Even so, colors are more vibrant than they are on standard WOLEDs, so the tandem panel is doing its job here. SDR colors have good enough accuracy out of the box to please most people who care about the creator's intent, but you can calibrate the TV to near perfection if you're after the most accurate colors possible. In HDR, it's a bit of a different story. Color accuracy is okay, but the image looks noticeably cooler than the industry standard 6500 Kelvin. There are color errors throughout, with the most notable being undersaturated reds. This isn't that unusual and can vary from unit to unit. However, we had a hard time calibrating our unit in HDR, since many of our adjustments weren't really doing anything. We were able to greatly improve the color temperature and white balance, but the overall accuracy of colors remained mostly unchanged. It's possible that this is a firmware issue, since we encountered similar accuracy issues after we updated our firmware on the C6, but we don't know 100% for sure. Another aspect of HDR accuracy is EOTF tracking, and we're happy to report that the C6H does an excellent job staying true to the content creator's intent. It's not perfect, and some scenes are slightly dimmer than intended, while some are slightly brighter, but it's hardly noticeable. There's a roll-off near the TV's peak brightness, which helps to retain details and highlights that are brighter than the TV's capabilities. The C6H has some of the best gradient handling we've ever seen. With our standard test pattern, there's essentially no visible banding at all. There is a bit of a caveat here. When the LG C5 and G5 were released last year, there was excessive banding that was very noticeable in darker scenes. LG fixed this with a firmware update, and gradients were quite smooth after that. However, many enthusiasts were put off by the diagonal lines caused by dithering that could be noticeable in darker scenes if you sat really close to the screen. So the big question is, are those diagonal lines gone? Well, kind of. We tried many different scenes to try to get the diagonal lines to appear, but they were absent most of the time. However, there was one dim scene from The Green Knight where we did encounter diagonal lines in Dolby Vision, but these ones are more spaced out and they are even more visible from a normal viewing distance. We tried to recreate these artifacts with other content and in HDR10, but we couldn't, so these lines are quite rare. You might notice them once in a blue moon, but it doesn't compare to the lines that were present on last year's C5 and G5, even though these ones are more visible. Unfortunately, some Dolby Vision content has a bit of a halo effect compared to the same content in HDR. This is subtle, but it's a bit disappointing that there are inconsistencies between the two HDR formats. LG OLEDs have always been a top choice for gamers, and the C6H is no different. It has 4 HDMI 2.1 ports capable of up to 4K at 165Hz. On top of that, it supports G-Sync, FreeSync, and HDR4 and VRR, so there aren't any compatibility issues with different consoles and GPUs. It offers low input lag, especially at higher refresh rates, and motion looks nice and clear thanks to its nearly instantaneous pixel response times. Combine those features with the TV's stellar image quality, and the C6H is an excellent choice for gamers. So how does this TV compare with other models in the market? Well, at the time of the release of this video, you can still easily find last year's G5 in stock for a similar price to the C6H. The G5 is a bit brighter, has a slight edge with color volume, offers an even wider viewing angle, and does a better job handling reflections. On the other hand, the C6H has superior gradient handling and barely suffers from those diagonal dithering lines. In the end, most people won't be able to notice much of a difference between the two TVs, so go with whatever one is cheaper. The C6H is an impressive TV that most people will be very satisfied with. It offers better brightness and color vibrancy than traditional WOLEDs like the smaller C6 or the more budget-friendly B6. Can't quite match the performance of LG's G Series model, but it does come close. Once the TV is out for a few months and prices start to settle, it's a fantastic option for those shopping for a 77 or 83-inch model and want a primary RGB tandem panel but can't justify the more expensive G6. That's it for our review of the LG C6H OLED. Would you pick this TV over the more expensive G6, or would you rather shell out some extra cash for the flagship model? Don't hesitate to let us know. And if you have any questions, our staff and community are on Discord too. Come check us out.